Bismillah wa salatu wassalam ala Rasulullah. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great honor to be here. As we say, I'm always in your Georgetown satellite campus. Had your dean, Ahmed Dalal, come speak in one of my classes just before coming here. So Georgetown is very dear to me. We have Georgetown students coming into our Northwestern programs in Qatar. So this topic, yes, I thought it was very arcane, so I'm happy that some of you could come out. I know it's just for the food, but anyway, it's exciting to me anyway. I should mention that this is part of an ongoing book manuscript, and I assaulted Professor Vol with the introduction and first chapter last night, so the draft thereof. So anyway, my ideas are sort of coming together on this topic, and I appreciate any feedback you have. So the subject is about Sufism in the 18th century, the foundations of the Tijaniyyah. So basically I'm dealing with, if you haven't heard of the Tijaniyyah before, just a brief overview of why it's important. So Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, situated well within the 18th century, in the early 19th century as well. He does have this classical scholarly training, Ash'ari, Aqidah, Maliki fiqh, as well as his later articulations in Sufism. So it points to this sort of shared dialogue between the ulum-ad-din, or the classical knowledge sciences, in the 18th century. He's connecting himself with many different scholars across the Islamic world at the time, so it's an important insight into these networks of 18th century scholarly renewal. It's claiming to have originated its Sufi order by direct command of the Prophet, yaqzatan la manaman, in a waking vision, not through a dream. And this is somehow perhaps quantitatively different, but not qualitatively different from things that have come before. So this requires some sort of situation. People, of course, the Prophet appearing in many instances of seminal moments of Islamic history, and that has a greater foundation. He takes up residence in Morocco 1798 and becomes appointed to the Mawlay Suleiman's scholarly council. The Sultan gives him a house to live in. There's a claim to paradigmatic sainthood coming out of the Tijaniyyah as other Sufi orders. The major Zawiya or Sufi lodge center of the Tijaniyyah is today in Fez. But its primary base primarily popular base is in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily West Africa, but is now found all over the world, from Indonesia, Turkey, Albania, India, and even in Qatar. It's, as I said, spread mostly to Africa, but also elsewhere in the Middle East. So this is the primary source of the Tijaniyyah Sufi order. There are lots of politics surrounding this book's publication. This is what I consider the most authentic publication, which didn't come out until 2011, one of the reasons that necessitates looking at this topic once again. And it's actually based upon a manuscript, the original manuscript of the document written in 1802 that found its way into Kaolack, Senegal. So that's another interesting story. Just to give you a sense, this is the Zawiya itself in the tomb of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani in Fez. If you haven't been there, it's one of the most astounding examples of Moroccan craftsmanship. It's been all refurbished. This is the house that Mawlay Suleiman gave him. And this area right here is where he passed away in 1815 after the dawn prayer. Yes. So to give you a little bit of sense, there's a yearly report published out of Georgetown, I believe, published out of Jordan, I believe, with the collaboration of Georgetown, the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. The head Tijani Sheikh today This is in 2014, ranked the 13th most influential Muslim in the world, the highest of any other Sufi order. There's the numbers of Tijanis in the world today, probably always difficult to estimate, but maybe 100 million or so. If so, this would constitute a much larger Muslim so-called movement than the Muslim Brotherhood or any of the other things that fascinate Western media. This is the current Sheikh Tijani Sisi, here with the Emir of Kano. The Emir of Kano presides over a city of roughly 11 million Muslims, 8 million of whom are Tijani, so it just gives you a sense of the numbers. You can't really read this writing here, but here are more pictures of Sheikh Tijani Sisi. And this one, this is him sitting down in between the two khutbahs, the Friday sermons. He's the Imam of the mosque there, but this staff is the staff of Sheikh Ahmad Tijani himself. And so here's sort of like the Jalal and the Jamal. Yeah, I just put this up there because the Sheikh is actually in Washington, D.C. this weekend. He's giving a conference at the Turkish Islamic Center. This is a picture from a conference he gave last weekend in London about Sheikh Ahmad Tijani as being the seal of the saints. Yeah. So anyway, if you want more information, they have a website there. Yeah, and this is also the National Chief Imam of Ghana, who is a follower of this Sheikh. And so you can see he's also here in Washington. Okay. So this kind of conversation then has to deal with a lot of stereotypes about the 18th century and about Sufism in that period in particular. And of course, there are certain stereotypes and polemics that surround the Tijaniyyah itself, as well as other particular Sufi orders. And I'm really following in the wake of Professor John Voll, who was one of the first to really push against some of these stereotypes. So it's an honor to be here with him, but I'm a bit nervous to speak in front of him. So, so one of the stereotypes about the 18th century, of course, is that really after the golden age of Islam, however it's defined, it could be during the time of the Khulafa Rashidun, the four righteously guided caliphs, or it could be during the time of the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in the Abbasid Caliphate. Then everything sort of collapsed and went down, and Muslims Islamic sort of intellectual inquiry stagnated. And that really got so bad by the 18th century that colonial powers had no choice but to invade and take over and reawaken the Muslim world with their rational thought. And so you have various movements. So the Arab Nahda, for example, is associated with kind of the translation of European works into Arabic, etc. So people have then gone back to look at, so well, what is actually happening in the 18th century right before European colonial conquest happens? Well, there were important social and political changes. You had the formation of the Wahhabi movement, kind of the foundation of the nascent state of Saudi Arabia, not really happening until 1923, but the ideological and political alliance is established during this time. We have various jihads that seem to be led by Sufi orders in Somalia, in Senegal, in Mali, in Mali, in Libya, in Algeria, in Chechnya, and really the only people fighting colonial conquest during this time is not actually the Wahhabis, it's Sufis leading jihads. And so people have difficulty then understanding, well, what's actually Sufi about these people taking up arms? And so just, the earliest understandings, which Professor Voll unraveled quite a bit, were suggesting that these were somehow neo-Sufis, or not really. They weren't really Sufis. Islamic scholarship during the time in general is derivative, not original. There's a new book published by Ahmed Dalal called Islam Without Europe. It just came out a couple of months ago. He's really pushing against this theory, but mostly from the perspective of usul al-fiqh, or legal methodology, and also usul al-hadith, the theory of hadith scholarship. And he definitively makes the point that these scholars are incredible scholars, talking about Shah Wali Allah, Muhammad al-Shawkani, and they're really pushing forward, legal theory during this period and not considering themselves beholden, or certainly not less than previous scholars, right? So Shah Wali Allah is considering himself like the Ghazali of his time, right, out of India. So one of the things that, there's an ongoing dispute in this field. What is the importance of scholarly exchange? What's fascinating about this period is that most of these scholars knew each other in some way or another, or had very few degrees of separation in between them. So there's a dispute, I think two false extremes. On the one hand, that because scholars knew each other, then they have to have shared everything in common, that they presumably would have dressed alike, etc. And on the other extreme, that they don't share anything in common, that it's completely illogical to think about these scholarly connections as sharing any sort of knowledge or methodologies or perspectives about the world. Obviously, I think both of these extremes, and I think many of us, Professor Voll also agrees, that the truth is somewhere in between, that I think as he put it in very brilliantly, the idea of having a discourse doesn't mean, it means that people are debating similar things. It doesn't mean that they share their opinions about everything. And then, of course, especially into the 19th century, when colonial conquest becomes much more of a reality, people are looking at the 18th century as sort of being ideologically responsible for whatever messianic movements, in other words, the Sudanese Mahdi, that come out during this period. And so the Sudanese Mahdi, his munqata'a, his severed connection to the Sammaniya Sufi order, for example, is thought to be explicative of his messianic impulses. So these are things that obviously need to be sort of thought about more critically when examining the vibrancy, really, particularly with Sufism, that's going on in the 18th century, right? That this is, yes, they're cognizant and aware of previous scholarship in the field. For Sufism, that certainly means Ibn Arabi and al-Ghazali, but they're not seeing themselves as wholly restricted by those articulations, right? And they are actually coming up with their original thought on their own accord. So with the Tijaniyyah, of course, has its own stereotypes that surround it in the literature that are important to unravel. The most important, really, is this idea that the Tijaniyyah is somehow a uniquely African Sufi order. And of course, while that's true numerically, most followers of the Tijaniyyah today are in so-called Black Africa. That's not exclusively true. And it needs to be questioned, what are the racial assumptions behind this sort of association. And so when many people say, well, so you find many overviews of Sufism that really marginalize the Tijaniyyah Sufi order as being somehow not really important. They either concentrate on classical Sufism, so therefore it's understandable, or they concentrate on the heartlands of the so-called heartlands of the Muslim world in the Middle East. Really just only mentioning the Tijaniyyah in passing. The problem being that Tijaniyyah is arguably the most popular Sufi order in the world today. It's spreading outside of Africa very quickly, even since the 1980s, hasn't really been accounted for. And it's spreading while having an unapologetic Black African leadership. So I've written another article on that, but I'm not really going into today, called Afropolitan Sufism, thinking about the ways in which African identity is negotiated, not as a racial category, but as a productive sort of cultural expression within the spread of the Tijaniyyah in places like India and Turkey and Saudi Arabia even. Lots of these other things kind of go into the sort of ingrained pejorative conceptions about African Islam and African Sufism more broadly, right? That African Muslims are somehow separated and isolated from broader currents of scholarship, that they're prone to messianism, that they're not really applying or implementing the Sufi tradition itself, that they're sort of depending upon grace instead of fadlillah, instead of tazkiyat an-nafs, the sort of or purification of the self, the sort of things that Sufism was classically associated with people like al-Ghazali. And so there, and then of course the debates surrounding Ibn Arabi are very clear in this, that the Tijaniyyah and particularly later scholars of the Tijaniyyah in West Africa couldn't have properly understood Ibn Arabi. So you have somebody like Chodkewich saying that Shaykh Ibrahim Niyas doesn't have direct access to Ibn Arabi's texts, and he doesn't really understand what Ibn Arabi is saying, despite the fact that Shaykh Ibrahim Niyas in his book Kashf al-Albas, which I translated, has specific citations from the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, Ibn Arabi's main text, by page number. So it's sort of pointing out that people's stereotypes fail to allow them to actually see the evidence in front of their face. And so the Tijaniyyah itself, my argument here is that its omission is a really it's a glaring omission in the scholarship of Sufism in the 18th century more broadly. This is a formative movement. It's connected with all of the most of the scholarly currents of its day. It is articulated in the 18th century and early 19th century in Morocco, which is a fervent ground of intellectual development and social reform. It's the basis on which it's spread into West Africa. Is not about the sort of lack of knowledge of West African scholars, but the fact that they were thinking about similar ideas in West Africa, actually predating the 18th century, going way back into the 16th century, forming the basis that on which the Tijaniyyah was received as being sort of having a resonance with what ideas that were earlier articulated among the scholars of Timbuktu. Okay, so so these are so what I'm going to talk about today are just some of the basic scholarly currents that give rise to the Tijaniyyah. And this is sort of a preliminary conversation then to think about Sufism more broadly in the 18th century with some specific articulations of the Tijaniyyah in that regard, right? So basically all of the ideas that come to the forefront with the foundation of the Tijaniyyah are already there in previous Sufi scholarship. It's just their sort of combination with the Tijaniyyah that is perhaps somewhat distinctive. The North African Shazaliya, obviously Shaykh Marjani has very rich contacts with the Wazaniya, the Nasariya. These are various branches of the North African Shazaliya that are very popular during from the 17th and 18th centuries. Most of these articulations have some sort of a fascination with the idea of Qutbaniyah, or axio-paradigmatic sainthood. They have an idea that a saint can have shafa'ah, can have intercession for all of the people of his age, perhaps, right? Or there's a sort of fascination that associating oneself with a paradigmatic friend of God is a source of salvation more broadly, right? So this is not new with the Tijaniyyah. It's also not new with the North African Shazaliya. It should be pointed out. It's there across the Muslim world at this time. The Egyptian Khalwatiyya is it's a Sufi order originally coming out of Turkey, which seems to undergo some sort of revival under this Syrian scholar Mustafa al-Bakri. It comes established, it has its greatest success in Egypt, where most of the sheikhs of Azhar at the time in the 18th century become associated with it. So Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, when he makes his pilgrimage, he stays in Egypt for some time and he meets with the most prominent Khalwati sheikh of his time and actually becomes the sort of lead deputy of the Khalwati Sufi order in North Africa before the Prophet appears to him and gives him the Tijaniyyah. So the Egyptian Khalwatiyya most explicitly with Mustafa al-Bakri, and Mustafa al-Bakri is also one of the only two students of Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi, who is a Naqshbandi sheikh, famous for his explorations of Ibn Arabi during the time. He dies in 1731. So there's clearly this kind of idea of ongoing tarbiyah, or ongoing spiritual training, that is very pronounced in the Khalwatiyya. Also the idea of ma'rifatullah, or the experiential knowledge of God, kind of is articulated through the works of the ongoing study of Ibn Arabi. And so Mustafa Mahmud Kurdi, for example. I'm sorry I'm throwing out so many new names that many of you have not heard of. It's not important. The ideas are what's important. Mahmud Kurdi then has dreams of Ibn Arabi that promote him, or that give him inspiration to write his Risalat al-Hikam. He has his own book of aphorisms that I'll talk about a bit later. This is an interesting topic which is becoming very popular now in Islamic studies, to talk about talismans and the ulum al-asrar, the esoteric sciences. Obviously this is a controversial subject, and it was so during the 18th century as well. The importance of a book like Jawahir al-Khams is actually coming out of India from the 16th century, is that it's sort of like it's a way that the ulama, or the classically trained scholars, probably would have understood those sciences. In other words, it sort of walks you through the logic of that book, of this science. And others like it also point out the ways in which these sciences can be misused, right? If you're not, if you don't have good tawheed, if you don't have good knowledge of God's oneness. So what I'm going to talk about just very briefly then are the three primary initiators of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani before he declared the foundation of the Tijaniyyah. They are Mahmud Kurdi, that I spoke about here. He is the primary Sheikh of the Khalwatiyya in Egypt. Ahmed al-Hindi is a somewhat mysterious figure, but by his name he's Indian, probably Naqshbandi. He's in Mecca, known as the Qutb of his time, or the paradigmatic state of his time. And it seems that he does transmit the Jawahir al-Khams to Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, and therefore gives us some sort of an insight into the esoteric sciences. And of course, Muhammad al-Samman is also known as the Qutb of his time. He's in Medina Munawwara, has the keys to the Prophet's tomb, and of course he's the one, the name by which the Samaniyya Sufi order, very popular in Sudan and Indonesia, later gets known. Okay. I wanted to give a quick background, perhaps if I can just skip forward. I'm sorry to confuse you, but yes. So Ibrahim Qurani is often appearing as a foundational figure for these 18th century networks. In other words, most of the scholars in the 18th century are somehow connected with this very great scholar that lives in Medina, dies in 1689, specializing in hadith, also considered one of the great defenders of Ibn Arabi during his time. He's variously associated with the Naqshbandiyya, or the Shatariyya, which is the Sufi order no longer really practiced, but it's associated with Muhammad al-Ghawth, who is the right one, the author of the Jawahir al-Khams, the book of 5 jewels. He and his cohorts have a disagreement with the followers of Ahmed Sirhindi out of India over the concept of wahdat al-wujud, or the idea of the unity of existence. And they consider Ahmed Sirhindi's idea that the unity of existence is a subjective experience, not an objective reality, to be a heterodox opinion. And actually fatwas get produced in Mecca and Medina during the time against Ahmed Sirhindi for that idea. So Ibrahim Qurani then is this seminal figure. So yes, Tajuddin al-Uthmani is also the disciple of Ahmed Sirhindi's sheikh, so they both have the same sheikh. They disagree, and Tajuddin al-Uthmani actually comes to the Middle East as a result of that disagreement. So Abdullah al-Basri, also somebody that John Vole wrote about quite a bit, is connected with Ibrahim Qurani, transmits to both Mustafa al-Bakri and other people like Shah Wali Allah. And Mustafa al-Bakri then is the person that So his connection, the Khalwatiyya, goes through Ali Karabash in Turkey or Anatolia. And he's also connected with Abdul Ghani Nabosi. Abdul Ghani Nabosi only has 2 real students that he gives full ijazah in, and one of them is Mustafa al-Bakri. So here we have Mustafa al-Bakri to Mahmud Kurdi, who is the Sheikh of Sheikh Ahmad Tijani, also to Muhammad al-Hifni, who is the Sheikh al-Azhar of his day. So the point being that Ibrahim Qurani is this important figure in 18th century Sufism. Khalid Ruwayb at Harvard has taken a look a little bit at his writings on Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, and also I think made a good point that Ibrahim Qurani is coming with a sort of original interpretation, or is not backing away at all from Ibn Arabi. This is a book that Khalid Ruwayb did not look at, and it's recently published, called Risala fi Wahdat al-Wujud. I found it in the Qatar National Library of all places, which, if you know, it's very strange to find that in a Wahhabi country, but there it was. So it's a collection of different books. Matla' al-Jud is one of the major texts of Ibrahim Qurani about the oneness of being. Interestingly enough, this book is actually published. This man, Sayyid Abdul Fattah, is a disciple of Salahuddin al-Tijani, one of the great contemporary scholars of the Tijaniyyah in Egypt. So this book is actually published by the Tijaniyyah Sufi order. It demonstrates the ongoing importance then of these scholarly networks and the ideas. So here you can see, Ibrahim Qurani, diving right in, taking some of the more difficult statements of Ibn Arabi and defending them, explaining them in certain ways, right? So Ibn Arabi says the real, meaning Allah, is present, mawjood, bi dhatihi, li dhatihi, right? Very difficult statement to understand. He is present in his essence for the sake of his essence, right? Which leads to the question, what is everything else we're seeing? Even in Qurani, he says, well, the world exists through God and not through itself, nor for itself. All existence is bound to the existence of the real. In other words, there's nothing that's real in the creation. So I make an argument that these sorts of ideas, very clearly pronounced in the Tijaniyyah as well. And Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is asked by his disciples, can you explain what Wahdat al-Wujud is? Can you explain what the unity of being? He says, a parable for the observer is ink. See, various letters, words of different types and meanings all give form to ink, but they do not escape their singular reality of ink. If you were to look at the essence of these shapes that form various letters and words, you will see nothing but the ink that has manifested tajalla in different shapes while retaining its essence of ink. And in fact, so this idea of tajalla for Ibrahim Qurani, the idea of divine manifestation, is what sort of is able to reconcile the creation as an entity itself, but not different from the divine essence. This has interesting implications for Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. He actually has an interesting conversation about God's love for the disbelievers, which later day Salafis will sort of take out of context and use as an example of the heterodoxy of the Tijaniyyah. But it really goes back to this idea of the unity of being, because if all of the creation is somehow connected to God in this way, then how do we understand disbelievers? I'll just read one quote. It's just a paragraph, but I think it's very interesting to contemplate the sort of depth of understanding or reflection upon this idea in the 18th century in these texts. And this is from the Jawahir Ramani, the first primary source of the Tijaniyyah. He says, perfect knowledge is that the disbeliever is to be honored, for this is an arrangement and martaba belonging to the real, exalted is He, in which God manifests His judgment, ahkam. So He is to be honored internally, while disparaged and fought against externally, for that is the ruling of the Sharia, hukm al-shar', and divine wisdom. This matter is perceived by the Gnostic only, not from the perspective of the law, but this understanding is referenced by the Prophet saying, do not exalt yourselves over God by exalting yourselves over His lands and His servants. Whoever exalts himself over the servants of God exalts himself over God, thinking himself greater than God. End of the hadith. Truly understanding, or tahqiq, this hadith is found in what we said before, which is that all created entities are arrangements belonging to the real. One must submit to his ruling in what he has established of it in each of his creations, a ruling not turned back at anything. Legal rulings pertain to a thing's external nature, not its internal. But this is only for the one who is cognizant of the unity of being, wahdatul wujud, for he sees both differentiation and connection. Being is one essence. It is not divided in parts despite the multiplicity of forms and types. So here you see a kind of like a social reflection upon this very dense idea that is first associated with Ibn Arabi. So I think what you see in the 18th century Sufism here as represented by Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is not a backing away at all from these controversial and very profound aspects of Ibn Arabi, but rather a further exploration of their meaning in actual social context. So that's just one background. So I'm going to skip ahead just to show you who Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi is very quickly. So Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi then also associated with Ibrahim Qurani, but through another Indian scholar. So you can see this scholarly circle of Ibn Qurani very wide. He has two students of note, Muhammad Abdul Karim al-Samman, who is the Shaykh of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, but also Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. This is my attempt to put him out in left field. So Muhammad Abdul Karim, so I'll get to that later. But so Wahhabi sources then talk about Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi as being one of the top 10 sheikhs that had influence on the life of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. And they somehow suggest that he was very critical that Muhammad Abdul Wahhab gained his understanding of the criticism of Sufism from Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi. This book would prove otherwise. This is Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi's Sharh on the Kitab al-Hikam of Ibn Ta'ala al-Iskandari, one of the key classical books of Sufism, written by a Shazali scholar in the 13th century. So here he's explaining the aphorism, "You are only veiled by the sons of Gnosis," I think Shamus al-Ma'arif, by the clouds of effects, or athar. And so here is his explanation, and you can see that he is in some ways suggesting that not everybody understands this, but he is very clearly interested in what is ma'rifah. As for the Gnostics, they see secrets in God's effects, the witnessing which increases them in illumination until witnessing created beings does not prevent them from witnessing the Creator. Rather, they see effects as a reflection of the sovereign Lord of effects, as if they were Him, except that in reality they have no attribution to Him. Exalted is God beyond that. So understand the secret of this matter if you are its custodian. So this is very interesting, and it certainly is not reflected in the later teachings of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, and gives a sense that that these sorts of ideas, contemplation about the gnosis of God, the relationship of God to His creation, is something that lots of people are thinking about, even in the midst of. So Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi is, of course, mostly associated with his ijtihad. He makes ijtihad in the Hanafi school, for example, not to pray with your hands down here, but to pray qabd. And he's also mostly associated with the transmission of a hadith. But here you find him very much exploring the profound depths of Sufi cognizance. So those are some backgrounds. The other background that I wanted to give is about West Africa. This is something that's often left out of the story about 18th century revival. And it's the point essentially to the fact that there is a version of the Tariqa Muhammadiyah. The Tariqa Muhammadiyah is, of course, this idea that the best Sufi order is to be associated exclusively with the Prophet Muhammad. It's an idea that you see all over the 19th century, but in various forms, from India all the way to Morocco. But here you have a 16th century scholar, Sidi Mahmoud, from modern day Niger, and H.T. Norris writes about this, but there's evidence then that, there's this idea already in West Africa long before it becomes popular in the Middle East a couple of centuries later. There's also ideas about Qutbaniyya or axial sainthood in Timbuktu. Oftentimes the stories of Sufism leave out West Africa because there are no established Sufi orders in West Africa really until the 18th century with people like Mukhtar Kunti, you see here, and the spread of the Tijaniyyah. The one answer to that is to simply say the scholars of Timbuktu thought themselves to be paradigmatic saints themselves. They didn't need, why would they become part of the Shazaliyah or the Qadiriyah when they already had their own awrad, their own litanies, which are also evidenced in the Timbuktu Chronicles, and they have their own traditions of axial sainthood. One of the interesting stories, but I don't have time to go into too much, is Muhammad al-Bakri, who is this very famous Egyptian scholar. And the key Tijani prayer, Salat al-Fatih, is sourced to Muhammad al-Bakri, who goes to Mecca and is looking for the best way to send prayers upon the Prophet. So this becomes the sort of core practical litany of the Tijaniyyah Sufi order, which is associated with Muhammad al-Bakri. The interesting thing, if you read the Timbuktu Chronicles, is that Muhammad al-Bakri appears everywhere, but he's not known to have ever visited Timbuktu. So there's a sort of idea that he visits spiritually, but he's thought to be, we know that some of the scholars of Timbuktu did make the pilgrimage and did meet Muhammad al-Bakri and took from him in person, but he also shows up in the Chronicles. He just appears in the mosque and he tells, he confirms the study of various Maliki fiqh texts, for example, books of Islamic law. There is no record of Salat al-Fatih, however, being transmitted to the scholars of Timbuktu. So one of the interesting reflections is to think about the ready reception of the Tijaniyyah, perhaps as a result of having the greatest secret of Muhammad al-Bakri, that they themselves, wanted to reconnect to this earlier tradition. The larger point that I want to make here, and all of these names are not important for you, but just to recognize that closer reading of these sources demonstrates definitively that black African scholars were at the centers of Islamic intellectual articulation in the 18th century, as they were in other times of history, right? They're there exchanging books, making sharh, making commentaries on books produced in the Middle East, in West Africa. They are also moving to centers of scholarship like Egypt and the Hijaz, and becoming, some of the towering figures of their age in hadith transmission, such like Saleh Fulani. The interesting thing was Saleh Fulani, who comes from modern-day Guinea, and figures in with all of the great sort of hadith scholars of the age, and the Salafis think that he's sort of one of the predecessors of the Salafi movement because of his emphasis on hadith. But he is also the teacher for Hamdun ibn al-Hajj, who is the great scholar of Morocco during his time, dies in 1817, and is the greatest faqih, is the greatest jurist in Sultan Moulay Suleiman's court, who becomes a Tijani. Muhammad al-Hafiz al-Shinkati is also Saleh Fulani's student, becomes a Tijani and spreads the Tijaniyyah south of the Sahara, is primarily responsible to him. Muhammad al-Kashnawi is another interesting figure. He's primarily associated with the teaching of the esoteric sciences, and he has written a book on the subject, which is being analyzed by scholars now. He's the teacher of Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, the teacher of Abdurrahman al-Jabarti's father. Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, the famous historian of Egypt, is also the student of Mahmud al-Kurdi. So you can see that this black African scholar from the shores of Lake Chad is, right at the center of the Khalwati Sufi revival in 18th century Egypt as well. My point here is not that Shaykh Ahmad Tijani had any teachers directly associated with West African scholarship, but they shared many, there were a few degrees of separation between them, and they shared many discourses that made the reception of the Tijaniyyah south of the Sahara so easy. Yeah, the other thing to mention is, okay, well, I won't, because I think going too fast. So Mahmud Kurdi, then these are the 3 case studies I wanted to go through very quickly. This is a book that's been recently published. It's a commentary on his hikam, or his book of aphorisms by another disciple, Abdullah Sharqawi, who is a great scholar in Egypt during his day. So he's known to have seen the Prophet every night, and it's from him when Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is asked about the legitimacy of coffee. He relates the story of Mahmud al-Kurdi, that somebody came to him asking, can he drink coffee? And then he saw the Prophet drinking coffee the next night. So I like that story very much. Yes, he composes his book after a dream of Ibn Arabi. The point being that this being the primary initiator or trainer of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, of all his sheikhs, I mean, Tijani sources will claim that, the Prophet Muhammad is the only sheikh of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. So we clearly see that as a reality for the Tijaniyyah. But there's also ways in which the teachings of Mahmud Kurdi and his name gets preserved very much in the later transmission of the Tijaniyyah. And so he has, this book of aphorisms is very interesting. It's very concise. So an example would be, ijhad tashhad, right? Seek and you will struggle and you will witness the divine reality, or seek and you will find, right? The last one simply says, if you cut the throat of your lower nafs, right? Of your nafs. He has things saying, avoid wagging the tongue over the words of the path without endowing yourself with the character traits of its folk. Avoid making claims, even if you are truthful. Good manner, good comportment is to be free from claiming a rank before attaining it and even after attaining it. Sharqawi comments, quoting Ibn Arabi, that this means that the claim should never originate from your own nafs. To be steadfast in worship is better than 1,000 spiritual unveilings or saintly miracles. So you see this very, the idea then that the 18th century moved away from the classical tazkiyat an-nafs, or purification of the self associated with al-Ghazali, then it's just completely false if you actually look at these texts. So I've already showed you this. This is where Mahmud Kurdi fits in within. Muhammad al-Samman wrote an important book, Nafahat al-Ilahiyya fi Kayfiyat Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya. This was actually a copy in the Abdulaziz bin Saud library in Riyadh, which you can find online. Very interesting book. He himself is known as a paradigmatic saint of his own age. Interestingly enough, Shaykh Ahmad Tijani meets him about the year before he passes. There's nothing in the sources that indicate that there was such a thing as a Sammaniyah during his own life. And in fact, he associates himself mostly with the teachings of Mustafa al-Bakri and the Khalwatiyah, and in fact considers Mustafa al-Bakri to be a sort of seal of the saints. So you also have from Muhammad al-Samman other ideas very similar to those of Mahmud Kurdi. He says, all of Sufism is adab, or etiquette. There is a proper etiquette for every time, state, and spiritual station. Whoever persists in good etiquette reaches where the distinguished folk have attained. Whoever forsakes adab is far from God, even while he thinks himself close, and is rejected even while he hopes for acceptance. So here once again you find these very classical Sufi ideas, much pronounced in the 18th century. Of course, Muhammad Samman in his book is also talking about the importance of, seeing the Prophet and having this experience mostly through salawat al-Nabi, or the prayer upon the Prophet, that this can actually bring the spiritual reality of the Prophet in front of you. So this is what he means by Tariqa Muhammadiyya, and obviously this is an idea that's shared elsewhere, but with some different variations. But so certainly the idea then of the formative aspect of prayer upon the Prophet, and engendering an experience of being in direct communication with the Prophet, which is what the Tijaniyyah really prides itself on, or is mostly about, really is already there with Muhammad al-Samman, and of course he doesn't get it from by himself either. This is traceable elsewhere. Okay. So this is his situation in these networks as well. I've already pointed this out. All right, to move to the esoteric sciences very quickly, Ahmed al-Hindi is a figure that, because of the weight of the secret prayers he's doing, allegedly he cannot talk to anybody in person. So Shaykh Ahmad Tijani has to communicate with him through a khadim, or through a disciple servant, and through letters. So when Shaykh Ahmad Tijani comes to Mecca in 1774, he tells his disciple, "This is the one I've been waiting for, and give him everything I have." And the disciple says, he gets mad and says, "Well, I've been with you for 18 years. Why this man comes from Maghreb and you give him everything and nothing for me?" He says, "Not my will, it's the will of God. If it were my will, I would give it to my own children." So here is the text actually of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani. This is one of the documents I'm working with that hasn't been previously looked at. This is a 49-page handwritten document in the handwriting of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, talking about his experience, his rihla going to the Hijaz. This document is primarily about the esoteric sciences, right? It's basically him writing down what he learned from various sheikhs. And here you see basically him saying, it's kind of difficult to read, but وَكُلَّمَا فِي هَذِهِ أَوْرَاقٍ مِنْ something الفاتحة إلى هنا إجازنا فيه شيخنا الشيخ الصالح سيد أحمد بن عبد الله الهندي كما أجازه, right? So everything, in other words, he says, in these pages I got from the Sheikh Ahmed al-Hindi as he got it from his sheikhs, right? And what you find primarily in these pages are, the pages from the Jawahir al-Khams, this book coming out of India, but primarily through the commentary of an Egyptian sheikh. Okay, so you see the rest. I'm going to flip the pages, but you see that he's the one that also encourages him to go visit Muhammad al-Samman. Yes, so this is the transmission of the Jawahir al-Khams. The book today is published by Tijanis. I bought this in Senegal. It was first, this form was actually done by Idris Iraqi, who is the head muqaddam or sheikh of the Tijani Zawiya in Fez in the early 20th century. The book itself then from Muhammad al-Ghawth is originally written in Persian, gets translated into Arabic by his disciple Sibghatullah and brought to the Middle East. This Ahmad al-Shanawi moves from Egypt, from Tanta, and makes his way into Medina Munawwara in the Hijaz to study this book and transmit it. And his sharh, the sharh of Shanawi, is considered very authoritative, but very difficult to find. And so Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is mostly quoting through the sharh of Shanawi. Shanawi says, so basically Shanawi's commentary is how you put all the secrets of this into practice. And he says, nobody will find my book except that I give him permission for it. So, Ahmed Kushashi then is the disciple of Ahmed Shanawi, who transmits the book to his chief student Ibrahim Qurani. So you can see then that all of this discussion about the 18th century and their hadith scholarships and usul al-fiqh, legal theory, leaves out important aspects, not only Sufism, but the fact that they're transmitting this book of, talismanic sciences along with hadith and other things. This is something that's completely left out by Ahmed Dalal's more recent book, which is valuable in its own right, but deserves reinscription and sort of understanding the strength of these connections, right? How it gets to Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, I don't understand. We haven't quite established the link between Salim Ba'alawi and Ahmed al-Hindi, except that the text suggests that there is such a connection. Salim Ba'alawi is, of course, associated with the Ba'alawi tradition out of Hadramaut. He is the student of Ahmed al-Shanawi. And according to the Ba'alawi scholars, it was actually Salim Ba'alawi that wrote the commentary on there's 5 chapters of this book. He himself wrote the commentary of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th chapters, but in the name of his sheikh. Ahmed Shanawi is, of course, not unexceptional for scholars and their students to do that. Right, so I'm going to wrap up so I can leave time for questions and people to make it to the Friday prayer if they need to. But what I'm suggesting here is that to better understand arguably the world's most popular Sufi order, which happens to be based in so-called Black Africa, one has to understand what's going on in the 18th century a little bit better, right? And to recognize that the Tijaniyyah really, its own internal narrative is of being a culmination of 18th century scholarship, which itself was a culmination of previous centuries of scholarship, right? And so this is evidenced by the way in which the Tijaniyyah preserves its links to these previous scholars through the various prayers that are performed or litanies, the way that their names are preserved in the various asanid and silsila, or lines of knowledge transmission, and the general respect for these previous scholars. So one of the ways of situating the so-called heterodoxy or strangeness of the Tijaniyyah, when people talk, well, the Tijaniyyah, when it's talked about, when it's not connected with what's going on in the 18th century, well, the Tijaniyyah is not like a real Sufi order because it doesn't have a line of knowledge transmission going back to the Prophet. There's just a claim that the Prophet came to Shaykh Ahmad Tijani and that's it. That's all they need to know, right? So yes, there is heavy emphasis on the vision of the Prophet, as there was in other Sufi orders of the time. But it's a karamat min al-karamat, right? It's a saintly miracle among other saintly miracles, right? And should not. It's a result, in other words, of one's pious devotion to God, not a replacement for it, right? The esoteric sciences, then, yes, they're used. That manuscript, I had to cut it off at the top because there was a khatam at the top. I didn't want to divulge the secrets. Sorry. So, yes, the esoteric sciences are there within the Tijaniyyah. Shaykh Ahmad Tijani is known as the sort of greatest scholar in that field at his time. But the primary sources are full of warnings against the misuse of these sciences, right? So they're for a sort of restricted elite who have properly understood the nature or the relationship of God to his secondary causes, right? So the problem being you don't want to, if you're not aware, if you don't have true understanding of God's oneness, if you see a jinn or a spirit come to you to give you what you need, you can be distracted and start worshiping or worshiping that jinn. So primarily then what's evidenced in the Tijani texts are exhortations against the misuse of this and sort of how to protect yourself from the spiritual entities that are surrounding you. Yes, so I've already mentioned this point about the Tijaniyyah and its residence in West Africa, the point being that ideas like the Tariqa Muhammadiyah, ideas like seeing the Prophet, ideas like the centrality of the prayer upon the Prophet, ideas like the esoteric sciences and their improper misuse. I just want to read the statement of Kashnawi. Remember, he's this Chadian scholar that comes into Cairo. He says, "My teacher made me promise that if I got to the places of the East, especially the Haramain, meaning Mecca and Medina, I should not reveal what I know of these ilm al-huruf, the letter-based sciences, and what resembles it from khat al-ramal, or geomancy, on account of their prevalent uses in these countries for causing corruption, tribulations, and dissension in plain sight of those of discerning minds." So, the West African perspective is that the people in the Middle East are always misusing these things. They don't know how to properly use them. And so you shouldn't share them with them because they'll be distracted. So it kind of gives you a sense that the Middle East people are less orthodox than the West Africans. This is certainly the perspective of many. You see this time and time again, articulated in Arabic by scholars of Timbuktu, right? Ahmed Baba, for example, disciplines the scholars of Morocco for their fanatical attachment to the Maliki school and not being able to recognize the important contributions of other schools. So this idea, I haven't really got into this, but this is important as well. The fact that I referred to it in the beginning, Shah Marjani was a mufti in his own right and has important legal rulings in the primary sources. He has this famous statement, if you hear something from me, weigh it on the scales of the Sharia. If it balances, take it. If it doesn't, then leave it. So there's this ongoing dialogue in Tijani sources about between the nas and the amal, right? Like, or the opinions of later scholars and the definitive text. So in a way, he's almost implementing a Shafi'i usul, thinking about, he says, if you find an opinion among the scholars, even of our Maliki school, he considers himself a Maliki, but contradicts an established hadith, you have to take the hadith. Right? So this is, I think coincides with Ahmed Dalal's reflection on a revival of legal theory in the 18th century, and it shows that Sufi scholars were also very much interested or considered experts in this field as well. Yeah, and the other idea for, in contradistinction to those who thought that the 18th century was somehow a period of stagnation and sophisticated Sufi understandings, the internal discourse to the Tijaniyyah and I think to many 18th century Sufi traditions is that they're going through this process of tahqiq, right, of verification and actualization. And in this process, particularly of the Akbarian tradition, that associated with Ibn Arabi, and so in this process then is the experience of divine gnosis, is explanation of the various hadrat, like the cosmological presences, and also the Rajal fil Ghaib, like the hidden hierarchy of saints. And actually, if you look at Tijani sources in particular related to the last question, there's an explanation of saintly rank that is wholly absent from Ibn Arabi. So he actually goes beyond. Ibn Arabi sort of ends his discussion about saintly hierarchy with the seal of the saints. And with the Tijaniyyah, they come up with an entirely new idea, which is the Qutb Maktum, or the hidden pole, which is actually beyond that of the seal of saints. So this is one example in which the 18th century scholarship, and Sufism in particular, really pushes this conversation forward. Now, what happened after that is the subject of another talk entirely, but perhaps we can talk about it in the discussion section. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for so many names, but hopefully you got
Thank you.
the points. Yeah.
Now, Professor, will give you a little rest.
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, Professor Foley is going to make some comments about the presentation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you're right. Sort of, it's fun listening to this presentation because I'm reminded of a bunch of old friends. That is, my old friend Muhammad Hayat Sindhi. I first discovered him back when I was sort of a graduate student and things like that. Just a couple of comments because I want you all to have a chance. But I'd like to emphasize some important dimensions. I'm not going to provide a critique. I mean, I have a special bias on this. That is, the kind of work that he is doing is something that I think needs to be done. And my bias is I'll say everything good about it, and I don't have any bad things to say. But part of the really important thing that is happening is where he started, and that is 18th century studies in general are studies that are always shaped by some general purposeful framework. And it's useful to have the stereotype of the 18th century in the Islamic world as being a time of sort of intellectual stagnation and static and so on, because it makes it easier to talk then about the virtues of the West. But we tend really to look at the 18th century, we all tend to look at the 18th century through particular lenses that are not necessarily lenses that help us understand what's going on in the 18th century. I have just sort of finished up the world history of the 18th century, sort of in 200 pages. But the thing that I found interesting in thinking about the 18th century in general is that people look at the 18th century usually for some other reason or through some other reason. So that even in the history of Western Civ, the 18th century is the foundation for modern thought. You don't get Voltaire as an 18th century thinker. You get Voltaire as somebody who lays the foundation for something in the 19th and 20th century. You don't get 18th century science and esoteric stuff in the West. You get experimental science to go for modernity. And so a lot of the historiography, even of Western history, a lot of the historiography of the 18th century is looking at the 18th century as the beginning of modernity. And if you sort of have reservations about that, then the other sort of stereotype is to emphasize continuity, and the 18th century is finally the end of medievalism. You know, Voltaire crushes the medieval church or whatever, and so on. And so that we tend to look at the 18th century remarkably for other purposes. But this sort of period really from around 1600 to around 1800, a couple of centuries, is a very interestingly distinctive time in world history. That it's the era of the first globalization. It's globalization before modern technology. And so the things that are happening are not modernizing, they are humanizing. They're not medieval, they're not modern. And we're looking at people then, somebody like Tijaniyyah, somebody like Ahmed Sirhindi and so on. These are all people who are dealing with important issues that are distinctive to their particular time. They aren't necessarily battling medieval, they aren't necessarily battling modern. And so that it's the kind of scholarship that you're doing, it helps to make it clear that these people were debating, and they were debating within a discourse that fit their time, but it wasn't just sort of, proto-modernity or proto-nationalism or something like that. It was in fact real for the time. Now, this means then that the organizations, that the dynamics of interhuman relations are also neither medieval nor modern. And you have what you had described is something that in, say, European history, there's a useful little term called the invisible college. That it wasn't an organization, it wasn't an institution, it was intellectual exchange. And that the thing that Zachary referred to that I had said at some point, simply saying that people share discourse doesn't mean that they are in agreement with each other. It means that they understand how they disagree. You know, I can argue with somebody and disagree with them, but if I have a shared discourse, if I am part of an intellectual network, we can work with it. Now, there's lots more that we can say, but I think that one of the things that is useful is to begin to get an even stronger sense of what it meant to be an actively teaching, actively writing intellectual in the globalizing world of the 17th and 18th century. And I think that this kind of work works with it. But in this sense, we are talking, if we're thinking about methodology, I don't know if any of you had the same feeling that I did, that I was listening to. I was listening to an ad for Ancestry.com. That is, intellectual DNA, intellectual genealogies, not necessarily physical. But that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with networks. We're not dealing with modern social movements. The Wahhabis of the 18th century, the networks around Ibrahim al-Kurani in the 18th century, these were not things that would fit within the category of modern social movements or something like that. They are networks, or they are webs of intellectual interaction, and that also shapes what is possible. I will close with my far-out speculation. What is the difference? And this is half kidding. I've done some work on Abdul Ghani Nablusi, who appears, and he's a very interesting polymath. In Damascus, doesn't do much of organizing anything, but he apparently was a very good teacher. The great biographical dictionary of al-Muradi, the great biographical dictionary for his time, listing all of the ulama and teachers, lists more people as having been students of Abdul Ghani Nablusi than of anybody else.
Well, Muradi was from Syria too.
Yeah, Muradi has some, but you know, it's this kind of. But Nablusi wrote about a trip that he took to the Lebanon, and I sort of worked a little bit on it because I was wondering, you know, networking means that people get together and they communicate with each other. And Nablusi describes his visit to Baalbek and his visit to a great scholar in Baalbek, and what did they do? And they did what we do. They went out to, if we could live in a place like Baalbek, they went out to a lovely garden and they sat under a grape arbor, and he describes, and one day we went and we looked at the magnificent ruins, and then we sat and talked under the grape arbor and so on. I enjoyed that particular passage because he said, we spent a whole night talking about the poem by Mutanabbi that begins, Aminas di Garib fi Tujurukabal, because it raises huge, complex grammatical and syntactical issues. I loved it because I spent 3 weeks in my advanced Arabic class at Harvard also battling with Aminas di Araki fi Tujurukabal. But one of the new things that's there, this is the far out theory, one of the new things that is there in these networks is coffee. Coffee was not part of social life in the 15th and 16th century. But by the 17th and 18th century, coffee was integrated. And I wonder if there is some connection between the growth of these more intimate scholarly discussions and connections and the introduction of coffee into Muslim society. But at any rate, thank you very much. It was great fun.
So Hamdun ibn al-Hajj, remember the scholar of Fez, he has a poem which he criticizes coffee.
Sure.
That he says, you know, it basically gives me headaches. But at the end he says, and how do I keep longing for you?
Yep.
Are you sure it's coffee and masara, since they were under the grapes?
Sure, sure.
Any questions? Yeah. Take them.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah.
Say your name and...
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I dabble in some Muslim studies. I was wondering that whether you thought, you know, in our society and the current epistemic environment, it's an adversarial, you know, that's the dominant form of engaging, which doesn't seem to go very far. But in the 18th and 19th century, would you say that the culture of conversation, I mean making artful conversation, I don't know if it applies so much to the you know, Sufi scholars and so forth, but certainly in the literary communities of, you know, just about any of the Muslim countries, the art of conversation was, you know, was very important. How to communicate, and as a add-on, wouldn't you say, Dr. Bull, that, you know, it's these networks and so forth, it's phenomenological almost, rather than it is anything else, and that's what we're discovering even in the current atmosphere. And I don't know if you read that book by the Harvard scholar just now who's written about networks, but it's phenomenological, so we sometimes don't know where things will go as a consequence. How discussions, where they will go ideologically, or so I just wondered if you had any comments.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think what you're bringing up about conversation as a form of transmission of knowledge is extremely important.
Yeah.
It relates to this question of orality versus textuality. Aside from the text that I showed you and various other letters, there are not actually any writings by Shaykh Marjani himself. It's his disciples that record what he says, including lengthy sharh or commentaries of the Hamziya, big poetical collections, etc. And in some cases, you find the disciple writing, well, the Sheikh has come up with a whole book in his head, and he even gave me the title, and here are the chapter headings, and he's delivered it to me orally. And it's extraordinary, you know. And he said, I can't even write it all down, but the
oral tradition.
Yeah. So the point being that orality has always, in Islamic knowledge transmission, has always trumped textuality.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
And we, that's how we understand why different companions of the Prophet actually burned their written hadith collections. Right?
Interesting.
They didn't want to be seen as less of a scholar for not having committed it to memory.
I see.
So I think that's important, especially with Sufism. It should be pointed out that when Sufis write, it's often the exception, and they're actually writing for very specific purposes. Of course, Abu Hasan al-Shazali puts it most famously, Kutubi Ashabi, my books are my companions. He's writing the knowledge on the internal beings of his disciples, not in pages of paper.
Naive question.
Yeah. What's your name?
Sayyid Amir. These different schools, Sufi orders in various parts of the world, which came about in the Middle Ages or late Middle Ages, early modern, are they independently generated, or they have influenced each other in Africa and Middle East, in India, for example? Do they come about as a result of interactions, or some ideas that initially are taken or borrowed from others? The second question is, this time, how do you access these ancient documents? Have they been digitalized, or is it easy, or somebody scholar like you say, or Dr. Wu, how would you access these old manuscripts?
Well, I think we all have our own strategies, so I'd like to know what risks or goals are. What you're asking is the key question, I think, in this field is how do we explain the arrival of these new intellectual traditions? Are they a result of some sort of combination of ideas learned elsewhere, or do they respond to local context? Obviously, I think Professor Vola and I agree that it's a little bit of both. And then, of course, these articulations have to respond to local context. But there certainly, that there is something special going on in the 18th century. Not to say that there wasn't previously, but perhaps that there wasn't as much later after colonial conquest of intellectual exchange. But that this is, that these were exciting ideas that people like to talk about, that they like to ask their sheikhs about. So even if a sheikh wasn't really interested, he would have to respond, right? And one of my favorite examples is Shaykh Marjani being asked about a verse of the Quran interpreted in a certain way by Abdulaziz al-Dabaq, who's this great Shazali, perhaps, scholar of Morocco of an earlier generation. And he's consistently asked about what's in this book, the Kitab al-Ibris, and he eventually says, well, the meanings of God are wide, It's not my interpretation exactly, but we respect what he said, kind of thing. So there's an idea that these ideas were circulated and people did think about them, but that there are certainly local contexts in which these ideas responded to. So I think narrating that correctly is the difficult challenge.
So the other question is, it was easily accessed.
Oh, yeah.
Documents.
Yeah.
For example, there's what I read is Timbuktu.
Yeah.
A lot of these ancient documents are there, but they're not preserved. And I think they are lately been trying to digitalize them
Yeah.
to make it more accessible. Well, what is the people experts like you? Or
Yeah, you gotta like manuscripts.
Yeah.
Well, there's two things going on. There's in Morocco especially since 2005 or so, there's this fluorescence of publishing activity in which the government has been sponsoring the tahqiq or the edition and republication of these old manuscripts. But other people are working with that as well. So within the Tijaniyyah, there's a prominent scholar in Rabat that's putting out all kinds of stuff. Stuff that was only in manuscript form until 2010 is now there. In Timbuktu, Northwestern Library has only one of two manuscripts in the world that is, I think, the earliest manuscripts relating to the scholarship of Timbuktu. That's of Muhammad al-Qabri, who taught the Aqib lineage out of which Ahmed Baba later emerges. I think I was the first one to wrote, it will be published soon, analyzing that text. So I think there's just a lot of work to be done. If any of you are interested in Islamic studies, please do African Islam. We need you. Too many of us in prior generations have narrated the story of Muslims in Africa from the colonial archive, and it's hopelessly truncated. So we need to look at these texts.
And it's important to anybody who's interested in Arabic to find Islamic texts from sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, Arabists tend to sort of go to Middle Eastern documents rather than.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I have a question. Why 18th century? You know, is there, I mean, obviously, if you look at the route, they're going through Morocco, Egypt, Hajj, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going through the Sudan. So there is, you know, was transportation easier in the 18th century, or they had not, you know, in the 17th century, we don't have enough scholars that would be interested. I mean, I know, you know, with the coming of colonialism, the traffic sort of got interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it about the 18th century that made these kind of, I mean, if you look at the number of people who could read,
Yeah.
they're very few. So obviously, you know, when they went to a city, they went to a person who could read.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out what the context is.
Right. Well, I don't think the 18th century is necessarily specific in that regard. I mean, there's clear evidences 16th, 17th century that's also happening. Professor Voll wrote in another place how 18th century scholars were very much interested in finding the sort of shortest hadith transmission. So it was, in other words, when you went to make Hajj, you would sort of seek out scholars that would connect you with less people in between you and yourself to the Prophet Muhammad. So that sort of motivates these exchanges. But aside from population increases, perhaps, you know, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, but whether or not the 18th century is wholly specific or just a bit more. But certainly travel, it's not that easy during that time, right? These journeys are often in the company of many people, wives, servants, and whole caravans.
I would just add to that, if you expand it from, say, the 1500 to 1800, within that framework, in a lot of the areas where you would be traveling, and basically that means walking or riding on a horse or something like that, the law and order situation was better. That starting in around 1500, by 1500 you had an Islamic world that was from Senegal to New Guinea, and in that you had relatively stable political situations from the Songhai Empire in West Africa to the Moroccan Sultanates to the great 16th, 17th century Ottoman Empire and so on, the Mughal, that I think you had travel was easy, not necessarily quicker, but the law and order situation was better.
Yes, sir.
So you answered one of my questions with the presentation
What's your
about
name?
the Fahad Rahman. I'm not a student or anything like that. I'm just kind of an innocent bystander here. But
Because at the Invisible College.
Yes. So I visited Fez and was curious about why there was such a adoption of the Tijani teachings in West Africa, and I was told by a tour guide that we had that a lot of Senegalese come there, and I visited the tomb of the Sheikh as well. My question is probably a little more in line with what you just mentioned earlier, which is when you as a scholar living in the present, but then studying a lot of what the discourse had been in the past in some of these circles, how have you looked at or juxtaposed what sort of intra-Islamic, intra-Muslim discussions are happening right now across the diversity of practice within, let's say, Sunni Islam, and because it seems like that's sort of a meta topic in terms of maybe the narrowing of scope in certain ways of practice and adoption and intellectual development, and then as you compare it to what seems like a very diverse and very fertile landscape in the past, and that just may be my subjective interpretation or opinion, but I don't know if you've looked at those and seen or compared how historical discourse and discussion, even acceptance of ideas that were understood but not accepted, occurred in the past versus what we're seeing today.
Yeah, well, in answer to your first question, I know you said that I've answered it, but you brought up how the Tijaniyyah is presented in Morocco today, which deserves another explanation, right? If you want to read Johera Berian, if you read French, she wrote a book called Ahmed Tijani de Fez. And in that book, it's basically an ethnographical account of how the Tijaniyyah in Morocco gets presented as an exclusively black African Tariqa, so that when you go to Morocco, you do a tour and they'll say, here's the tomb of Sheikh Ahmed Tijani. He's the father of all the Tijani, of all the Senegalese, or something like that.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
And the Senegalese will come here, think that they don't have to go to Hajj. It's completely ridiculous.
That's exactly what he said.
Yeah. So what you need to know is that in a census taken in 1939 by a French colonial administrator, the Tijaniyyah was the most popular Sufi order in Morocco, outstripped any other branch of the Chazalier and other things, and gets gradually sort of the French. Actually marginalized the scholarship of the Tijani order in Morocco in precedence for the Shurafa, for the descendants of the Prophet. And that drives all of the scholars underground. And essentially renders the Tijaniyyah in Morocco incapable of sort of presenting itself as a scholarly vehicle as it previously was. That's not the case in West Africa. And there have been attempts to collect the literature produced by Tijani scholars in Africa, and Rudiger Seizemann and Germany tried to do it, and essentially had to give up because it was so voluminous. And that's the important thing to recognize, is that these Sufi traditions, the Tijaniyyah in West Africa in particular, are the vehicles for an incredible fluorescence of knowledge and of text, new publication in Arabic. So if you don't want to, if you're not interested in Sufism at all, fine, but you need to, in order to understand Arabic textual production in West Africa, you have to be familiar with what the debates are within the Tijaniyyah and other Sufi orders, because that's what people are writing about primarily. I guess that's the answer to your next question, your latter question as well, which is that these ideas are very much alive. And I think that's what's so interesting for me about the 18th century, is that these ideas have not been eclipsed at all. If the Tijaniyyah is the most popular Sufi order, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse himself dies 1975 in Senegal, said to have 60 million followers by the time of his death in 1975. I don't know of any other single Muslim movement that has similar numbers. And so that's a story that's completely marginalized from Islamic movements, literature on Islamic movements in the contemporary period. These are ideas that are founded and are really articulated and elaborated in the 18th century. That's why they're important So in a way, I am sort of guilty of looking at the 18th century from the frame of the present, but my frame from the present is much different, I think, from experiencing West Africa. One last question. Yeah.
I just was wondering, two things first. You mentioned that they were these movements, the three movements you mentioned, they were reactionary to colonialism. Whereas I don't know, I have no clue about neo-Sufism, but I thought the Wahhabism was a little bit more of collaborating with colonialism, wasn't it?
Don't tell them that.
And another question, which was very interesting point that the professor mentioned, that there were in the West, you had these philosophies, and in the East were these different, I don't know, the philosophies or reactionary movements or whatever we'll call them philosophies, but in the West it was all about tolerance, a movement towards tolerance, towards peace and humanity, and the three movements you mentioned in the philosophies in the East were more about violence, intolerance, and fanaticism. I don't know how could that be explained.
Well, maybe one place to start is to recognize that colonialism as a brutal oppression of other peoples around the world comes out of Enlightenment thinking in the 18th century. In other words, it's an expression of the mission civilisatrice, right? It's a way to bring the light of European rationality to the rest of the world, which is not about peace. It's not about humanity. It's about defining humanity in one's own self-image and forcing everybody else to catch up, right? Yes, I mean, that's one of the problems about 18th century scholarship. It's always defined as if Wahhabism is the sort of the fundamental example that defines everything else that's going on in the 18th century. Ahmed Dalal's book really takes that apart and shows you how marginal the Wahhabi movement was during its own period. That needs to be taken into account. I have a chapter in my book basically talking about Islamic humanism of Sheikh Tijani and other scholars, and you saw a quote from that portion, which is essentially talking about the universal humanity of all people, regardless of religious affiliation. I definitely think that that's an idea that allowed for later articulations coping with colonial conquests, such as, a believer can live for a long time in a place of no faith, but he can't last long in a place of no justice. Comes out of the Tijani tradition in West Africa. So yeah, we can talk about that at great length. I hope I've answered some of the questions. Yeah. You're not convinced. How so?
Because I learned about Wahhabism here at Georgetown University ages ago, but it has nothing to do with humanity or
Okay, so let me say it again. Wahhabism is the exception in the 18th century, right? The Mufti, Hanbali Mufti of Mecca, the scholars of Tunisia, basically all around the Muslim world produced fatwas against the Wahhabi movement. This long tradition of pilgrimage is actually interrupted, and the scholars of the 18th century say, you can't make Hajj now because those crazy Khawarij or Wahhabis have taken over and they'll kill people. So Hajj is now abolished. That should tell you how this movement was perceived in its own time.
Okay. Who taught you Wahhabism here at Georgetown?
I studied, I learned with, I had them as electives, Professor Stauser, I don't remember who exactly did that, but there was also the head of the Arab Studies taught me, Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay.
Ibrahim.
Yeah.
That was the course about Wahhabism that I took with him.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.